Welcome to the afternoon plenaries today. My name is Elina Lehtomäki. I'm from the University of Oulu in Finland, and I will be chairing this session. And I would like to first introduce our first speaker, who is Mirian Vilela, and she's Executive Director of the Earth Charter International and the Center for Education for Sustainable Development at the University for Peace. She coordinates UNESCO Chair on Education for Sustainable Development with the Earth Charter and served as a member of the UNESCO Expert Reference Group for the Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. Mirian Vilela, the floor is yours.
I would like to start by inviting you to think about our worldviews and our values, and the limitations we all have with our worldviews and values. The limitations we all have in terms of what we can see and what we cannot see, depending on the angle where we are, right? And maybe even to argue that probably at the heart of many of the world's problems we currently have of environmental degradation, climate change, social injustices, lies an issue around our worldviews and our values, what we see and what we cannot see. So much of the work we do involves our capacity to acknowledge through which lenses am I seeing things, through which angle am I seeing things, and what are the values that are informing or not our decisions. With regards to our worldviews, there is a very famous Brazilian theologian called Leonardo Boff, who wrote a book that he talks about the rooster and the eagle, or the eagle and the rooster, the metaphor of the human condition. So it's an invitation for all of us to think, when am I looking at something through the lenses of an eagle? Or when am I looking at things through the lenses of a rooster, right? Narrow, short-term, short-sighted, which is the lens of a rooster, right? Can you imagine what does the rooster can see? Now, when you are able to take the fly and high up as an eagle, and how much you can expand your view. So the book is called The Rooster and the Eagle, and the metaphor of the human condition, because we all have that possibility of, as long as we are aware and mindful of our limitations of what we can see or not. Much of it depends on the worldviews we have. And therefore, we do have this challenge of often questioning our worldviews and our values and what we can see. It depends on the lenses that we are looking at, right? Okay. So I have been working with sustainability for the past 30 years, at the first a lot in policy and conceptions, and then I embraced the notion of the values that are underlying our concept and our visions of sustainability, trying to clarify, trying to make visible what are those values, and then how we can bring that into education. So we have established, 10 years ago, we established a UNESCO chair on education for sustainable development that works at that intersection that you see there of the concept of sustainability, the values that are underlying sustainability, and how to bring that into education in such a way that is transformative and that is not inculcating values, that is not transmissive, it's not vertical, right? It's certain that in all our minds, if I ask you, what do you think about values education, there is largely an assumption that ethical values into education, bringing values or bringing ethics into education, there is an assumption that it's equal or synonym to abstract, equal or synonym to theoretical and philosophical conversation, right? There's a synonym that values education and ethics in education is not practical, right? So there are some assumptions here that I have been working on really over the past 15 years to try to demystify this assumption and really engage in trying to argue that values based education, of values education, bringing ethics into education does not need necessarily to be abstract, too philosophical, and theoretical, but actually it's part of our lives. All of us, we made several decisions today, starting from what time we're going to wake up, how we're going to sleep, what we are going to wear, the shoes, the clothes, the food. How am I going to interact with someone? Most, if not all, our decisions are informed by our values, but they are invisible in our societies, right? So all our decisions, starting from the food we eat and the way in which we behave in society and we interact with the world, are pretty much informed by our values. However, they are not necessarily visible. Okay, so what is the cost of a lack of values and ethics into education? What do you think could be the cost? Because although we see in many political discourses the importance of bringing values into education, the reality is that it's often taken off the curriculum, off the pedagogy, off the schools, because it can be a sensitive issue, you know, which values, how we are going to teach about values. Someone is going to impose Western values on non-Western people, and etc. So it's a little sensitive issue to talk about ethics and values into education, especially when we are not in the philosophical or departments of philosophy or departments of values or even religion. When it comes to engineering, law, business, this is often off the table. However, we could envision that the crisis we are currently living in the society, globally and locally, has to do with the crisis of our worldviews and values. It's very much ingrained there. So, what could be the costs of a lack of values and ethics in education? What could be even that costs, especially in terms of if we're not really explicitly making an effort to nurture values of sustainability and global citizenship? Because if it's off, it means that other kinds of values are there being nurtured, values of materialism, values of competition, values that are focused on of a small community common good, rather than the values that are embedded in the global citizenship that involves this notion of expanding our vision, our views, or in our vision to see our role as a planetary citizen. So what could be the cost of a vacuum in fostering the ethic of care, respect, and responsibility towards one another as humans, but also towards the large living world, making it visible? So we can see the result of that vacuum in not really addressing, and I invite you to think that one of the results of that lack of values and vacuum in values and ethics in education is that we have ethically and ecologically illiterate global citizens and citizens. So we have many lawyers, engineers, business people, leaders, making a lot of decisions because they have gone through a formal education system and they have masters and PhDs, but they're who know a lot about engineering, but not necessarily ethically and ecologically literate. So that's could be a problem when it comes to the common good. Okay, here are a few things that could be the result of this cost of a vacuum in values education. Careless and indifferent citizens, intolerance. We see increased intolerance in our urban societies, right? Everywhere. Although we have more people going through a formal education system, we see increased corruption, environment degradation, social and environmental injustices. These are a few examples that I invite you to think that this could be the result of a crisis of values a crisis in our worldviews. Citizens, leaders with a short-term and fragmented view of society and reality, rather than an expanded view as an eagle that sees the whole and sees far. Okay, last, negligent and visually impaired system. I don't know if you have seen the cartoon, Mr. Magoo. So it's a cartoon of a wealthy man who has an issue, a problem with, he's visually impaired. So he walks around, he makes a lot of mistakes, and he's very careless because he doesn't see, right? He has an issue of seeing, again, seeing. So I think that's a key issue of our society all around, North, East, South, West, independently of where we come from and the positions we are making. We make a lot of decisions like Mr. Magoo, right? We're visually impaired. We are not really able to see the consequences or even to care about the consequences of our decisions. One very concrete example, in January 2019 in Brazil, we had an awful, horrible disaster of a dam. Killed a lot of people, not only that, killed over 2,200 people were dead because of that dam collapse. But it was a dam of an iron mine waste. So it's a big issue. The issue here is that the leaders that were taking a leadership, making a lot of decisions, they were not lacking education, right? There were MBAs and engineers. The biggest company in Brazil doing mining was in charge of this, and many public and private people there. The issue is that there was a collapse of a dam that released the mud with a lot of chemicals on it, iron, and killed not only people, but a lot of fish. And so lack of ethics into education, that's the result. Another example, 10 years ago, Rana Plaza disaster or collapse. I don't know if you have heard of it, but certainly Bangladesh is one of the countries that produces the most of garments, the clothes we wear around the world. Europe, Latin America, many of them come actually from Bangladesh, although we only see the labels of the clothes we buy from, but they actually produce there. So Rana Plaza commemorate, remember this worst garment factory disaster in history 10 years ago, in which over 1,000 people were dead. Again, many well-educated people were in charge of this business. And the question is here is like, wasn't it maybe due to a lack of ethics into their process of education? Okay. So this leads me to ask, has been leading me to ask this question is our education system and practice nurturing values of unsustainability rather than a culture of care and respect? Therefore, care and respect for what? For one another and the large and living world. Is our current education system helping us to expand our views and our sense of care and respect that goes beyond the close borders that we have? So I have been looking at many of the education documents. Of course, I suppose many of you, or most of you, know all of these documents and many others. And it's quite interesting because all of them are emphasizing the importance of values, which is great, right? So in all these documents, so the first one is the result of the Incheon Declaration, was in May 2015, was the World Education Forum with ministers from all around the world. They issued this framework for action on SDG 4, which is on quality education. The second one is a document on global citizenship education, very important because it articulates what is global citizenship education and the importance of that. The other one is Education for Sustainable Development, ESD framework, roadmap. And the last one is Reimagine Our Futures of Education. So just to give you 4 examples of many of the UNESCO agenda documents or policy instruments that we can see that are all emphasizing the need that for all of us to rethink a kind of education that empowers learners with knowledge, skills, values, and attitudes to take informed decisions and make responsible actions for environmental integrity and so forth. So knowledge, skills. So if we have a knife as a metaphor of an instrument, we know a knife and we know how to use the knife. So we have the knowledge about the knife and we have the skills of how to use the knife to cut bread, to cut a piece of vegetable, but a knife could also kill someone, right? So it's an instrument. So it's an instrument that we have the knowledge and the skills to use the instrument, but not necessarily the values that can inform us of how that instrument can actually generate the misuse of that instrument can actually generate a bad consequence for the common good, right? So, but education is very focused on cognitive learning, knowledge generation and skills, right? But not so much in that part of, okay, the knowledge that you're acquiring, you have responsibilities that goes with it. Similarly, now with the artificial intelligence, it's a new instrument. How we are going to use the artificial intelligence. Similarly, with a knife, we can use a knife to cut the bread, but we can also use the knife to kill someone, right? So this is where values education lies. So if we look at Earthshatter Principle 2b, it's an invitation for us to think that the more knowledge I have, the more power I have, with that comes increased responsibility with the common good. So couldn't that be really at the core of our education purpose, that the more educated I am, the more knowledge I have, the more responsible I should feel to contribute with the betterment of society or with the common good. Okay, learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together are the 4 pillars of education for 21st century. But I invite you to think that why these first 2 are bigger there, I think, again, because there is more attention is given to learning to know and learning to do, and not so much on learning to be and learning to live together. And we need really to put our attention to that. The 5th one is the 5th pillar of UNESCO. In terms of the 4 + 1, 5 pillars of education for 21st centuries, education should be about learning to transform ourselves and society. Okay, so with all of this, I'm trying to make a case that we need to make more visible and explicit. What are these knowledges and skills and values that are underlying sustainability and global citizenship? Okay, so examples, knowledge. If it comes to sustainability, limits of the planet, Earth carrying capacity, social and environmental justice. How do we relate to one another? Skills, we have heard quite a lot here in terms of critical thinking, system thinking, future vision, creativity. So these are kind of skills to do things, again, in a different way than conventional education. But then the values, where do they get? How are the values of care, respect, responsibility, solidarity, the ethic of, or an earth ethic or an ethic of care, how are they being embedded, or how should they be embedded into education in such a way that it's not vertical or imposing, but rather nurturing? Okay, so important here to emphasize that indeed there is a notion that values and ethics, bringing values and ethics into education, it's all about inculcating a mindset. And I invite you to think that rather than that, it's about nurturing the learner's capacity to consider the consequences of decisions and actions. So again, what are the consequences at the short and long term of my actions and my decisions? So values education is about inviting us to think and reflect about what am I deciding and what are the consequences of my decisions. But also it's about examining what is informing my decisions. Why do I think the way I think? Through which lenses, questioning through which lenses I'm seeing things. Values and ethics education should be about questioning our assumptions and challenge our values and mental models. And be concerned, always concerned with how can I contribute to the common good. So it has a lot to do with, in the work we do with the Earth Charter, has a lot to do with expanding and deepening our views, expanding and deepening our consciousness with regards to how we ought to relate to one another and the large living world, making it visible. So the invitation here, and that's much of the work we have been doing with our UNESCO chair on education for sustainability through the lenses of the Earth Charter, is to see the Earth Charter as an ethical compass towards a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. Now, a compass is an instrument. You can use it also in different ways, right? But normally a compass is very useful when we are lost in the middle of the ocean or in the forest, that helps us, has a purpose to give us direction and invites us to think of where do we want to go. So again, so much of the work with values and global ethics education involves this importance for us to expand our consciousness of what we see in the world and foster a worldview based on values of sustainability and global citizenship. So lastly, just to give you a little briefing about the Earth Charter before I close. I know I'm almost there. So what is the Earth Charter? The idea of the Earth Charter emerged out of the Brundtland Commission report. It was part of the 92 Earth Summit back in 92. And it grew as a global civil society process that involved experts in environmental law, theologians, scientists, to articulate throughout the decade of the 90s, what are those values and principles that could guide humanity towards the direction of a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. So it can be seen as an ethical compass, as a common ground, as a framework, as an ethical reference, as a declaration of interdependence and responsibility, and above all, as an ethical reference. So many of us, we know about the Human Rights Declaration that's focused on human rights. The Earth Charter is focused on our responsibilities, what are our responsibilities and our sense of interdependence. So when it comes to citizenship, when we feel citizen of a place, it comes with it a sense of belonging, but also a sense of we have some rights as a citizen, and we have some responsibilities as a citizen of a country. So that's relatively easy for us to envision. But when we expand that vision of being a citizen, not only of our country or the community we come from, and invite us to think we belong to an Earth community, and as a global or planetary citizen, what could be our rights and responsibilities that go beyond our borders. So much of it, of this involves the work that we do with the Earth Charter. There are two UNESCO resolutions, so resolutions that UNESCO adopted, one in 2003 and the other one in 2019. There's basically resolutions that UNESCO adopted, recognizing the important role the Earth Charter plays as an ethical framework for sustainable development, and invites member states also to utilize it as an educational tool, and encourage actually member states to use their Earth Charter in their efforts on education for sustainable development. I'm going to end with this Earth community. So that's very key. language and words play an important role in our worldviews. The language we use, the words we use, this notion of we belong to a nurse community, but we also belong, we have a sense of responsibility to one another, the greater community of life. So words do play an important role in informing our sense of interdependence, our sense of interconnectedness with the large living world, and this sense of respect and care for the community of life, which are the values that, or the worldviews that are articulated in the Earth Charter. So it's not a closed group, by the way. The Earth Charter became not only an ethical framework as a document that articulates these 16 values in a preamble, in a conclusion, but it also became, since the year 2000, a global movement that invites organizations, universities, NGOs to use their charter as an instrument, as an educational tool, as an ethical reference to clarify and examine values rather than inculcate values, right? As an instrument to generate dialogue rather than an instrument for us to swallow. So it's very important for us to share here that that's the worldview that is articulated in their charter, and clearly this notion that we need to make our worldviews and values more visible and be there to question our worldviews and values, examine them, clarify, and really clearly clarify that the values that are leading our world towards injustices and climate change and environment degradation are certainly not the same values and worldviews that could reorient our global society towards a more just and sustainable world. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And there are many questions in Slido coming up again, but I would like now to invite Professor Magdalena Kuleta-Hulboy from the University of Warsaw to give her response to the talk now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Elina, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. I have a very difficult task because I had some questions and some responses prepared, but you just answered my questions. So, but during your presentation, I was preparing another ones. So thanks a lot for bringing up the important issue of value education, because as it had been said, even today, in one of the previous sessions, the value-based approaches are really lacking in discourse on education for social justice, global citizenship, and sustainability. And they are very much needed. And as, for example, my own research shows that referring to values may help in introducing global citizenship education into the subject teaching and schools educational programs, especially in the countries like my own country, my home country, Poland, where global citizenship education is not, or it is seen as controversial or as risky. And teachers who want to teach global citizenship education have to somehow smuggle it. And referring to such values like dignity, human dignity, responsibility, solidarity, helps them to introduce global perspective, global citizenship perspective into their teaching. However, and I totally agree with Professor Namrata Sharma, who said earlier that using the Earth Charter could bring together GCE and ESD discourses, because they are They act separately, but they are so linked together that it's even amazing that even the scholar academic conferences about education for sustainable development are not so popular among global citizenship scholars. So it's strange. However, I have some questions that your presentation just raised. One of them is, I am from Poland, and in my country, I feel like we even have too much values in education, especially the last, I don't know, 8 or 10 years. We are surrounded by values in every, I don't know, every subject, every governmental document, and so on. So religion lessons are present at schools, mainly Roman Catholic religion, but of course there are also some other religion lessons present, but as default, the Poles are Roman Catholics in general. So, and at the same time, the Polish society is probably not the most globally literate society in the world. So it raises the question of which values, what ethics in education. Very well-known biblical verse, love, I don't know if it's okay in English, love your neighbor as yourself. But probably all of us know that the neighbor could be defined in very, very different ways. And sometimes it's defined in a very narrow way, very exclusionary way. So this is an ethical statement, love your neighbor as yourself, but who is your neighbor? Every human being or just a person similar to you? And nowadays in my country, but not only in my country, I think it's also relevant to other parts of the world. I'm sure it is. The neighbor is not recognized as a human being, every human being, or even, which is more difficult, every being, if it's not so anthropocentric, if we want to be so anthropocentric. So this is one of the main concerns, that, of course, values and ethics in education are important, are needed, but we have to be very vigilant and careful about these values we want to nurture, pursue, and so on. Yeah, and probably that's the most important issue that your presentation brought to my mind. Thank you.